Hi, my name is George, and I'm 16. You could say I'm a fully grown-up guy. Maybe that's true, but it doesn't mean that I've been able to get myself back together after what happened when I was 10 years old. 6 years ago, I experienced the worst betrayal possible. My own mother's betrayal. My story began before I was even born. I ruined my mother's life while I was still in her womb. Well, I guess that's what my mum thought. The fact is that when my mother became pregnant with me, it happened very suddenly for her. You see, she was still a teenager and had hardly finished school when she met my father. At that time, he was a rock musician, not a rock star. No, my story's not about that. My father's band didn't get famous, but it did a few tours across small towns in the United States. During one of these tours, my parents met and liked each other, and after a couple of months, my mother found out that she was pregnant. When her parents found out, they demanded that she get rid of the problem, and when she refused, they simply showed her out. They felt that if she was so reckless, she could go and look for her child's father now, and it was then that my mother left her parents' home forever. So I've never seen my grandmother or grandfather, and to be honest, I don't regret it at all. If only my grandparents were a bit more merciful, perhaps my life would have been completely different. It wasn't easy, but my mother found my father. He gave her big belly a philosophical look. But of course, he wasn't going to marry a girl he'd already forgotten, let alone have children with her. But he promised to remember that I existed and send my mother money when he had the chance. It meant that he too was not rich at all. But at that time, it was enough for my mother. Because from this moment on, a very difficult period began in my mother's life, which meant in my life as well, because I fully depended on her. My mother did not go to college, and she didn't have any skills that were in demand, so just to find a job was a real challenge for her. And then I was born, and things became even worse, because I needed attention. We changed one rented apartment for another because she didn't have enough money to pay rent for a long time. And we not only changed apartments, but even cities. I don't remember much from my early childhood, except for maybe my constant horrible hunger and my mother's tears when she would share some strange-looking food with me. That was the way we lived, on only what my mother earned from her occasional jobs and welfare from the government. In the meantime, hoping to get her own life together. Well, the result of getting her life together was Lindsay. She was born when I was already 4 years old, and she was even less lucky than I was. Her father just simply vanished. Our mum didn't even know what his last name was. So the next 4 years were even worse. We almost starved. The food stamps were always not enough, because it was really hard for my mum to get them. Mum was trying to carefully avoid any attention from the social workers, because she was afraid that they would take her children away from her. I don't know how this story would have ended, if not for the new man in my mother's life. He was not like any of these guys that were attracted by my mother before. They met at the store where my mother worked as a cashier, and started chatting. And my mother, for some reason, told him the full story of her life, and he, in turn, told her his. His name was Hugo. He was 14 years older than her. He lost his wife a few years ago, and was now a widower. But what mattered most was that he was the first man who didn't judge my mother for her past. And it seemed that he was also the first man who was sincerely and seriously interested in a relationship with her. I don't know how their relationship developed, because Hugo almost never came to visit us at home. But he paid all the bills and supported my mother in every other way. About a year and a half after they met, he proposed to her and asked her to move into his house. Of course my mother agreed. After many years of moving from one rented apartment to another, never knowing if she would have enough money to pay rent for the next month, the very thought that she would now have her own house where she would be able to stay for as long as she wanted, never having to hurry to abandon it or rush to pack her things in bags, seemed fantastic. She literally glowed with happiness. Lindsay was still small, and took the changes in her life easily. But I was almost 10 years old. I understood that Hugo would soon become my stepfather, and frankly speaking, I was afraid of him. You see, I grew up without a father, and all my communication with my biological father was limited to sporadic phone conversations, during which my mother usually made me ask him for some money. And now I had to live together with a grown-up man who made a scary impression on me by just the way he looked. And you know, Hugo turned out to be exactly who I thought he was. A month had not passed since we moved in, when he told my mother, "George has to move in with his biological father." My stepfather didn't even try to put it nicely. He said directly that he couldn't treat me as his own son, even to the extent that he actually admitted honestly that my very presence in his house irritated him. My mother was in shock by this state of events, and could neither agree with Hugo nor disagree with him. I guess she was afraid to lose her husband as much as she was afraid to lose her son. And soon, my mother got pregnant and just dropped the topic, with the excuse that now she couldn't get stressed since it was harmful for the baby. It was a significant argument for Hugo. He wanted to have his own biological baby, so he tried to spare my mother from everything. He made me do all the housework and forbade me to even go close to my mother while she was expecting. Hugo was sure that I was the one who was always making her nervous and upset, and this was just the beginning. The worst thing was this psychological pressure that he constantly put me on. No matter what I did, he was never happy, and I was always wrong. I had to get perfect grades at school, I had to exercise until I was totally exhausted, otherwise Hugo would insult me, calling me stupid and weak. My stepfather never hit me, but this psychological pressure coming from him was almost as bad and hard. Hugo called me a whiner and a crybaby, but this wasn't true. I was taking it all like a man, I swear. The only thing I couldn't tolerate was when my stepfather started to talk badly about my biological father. I don't know why, but this was too much, and I broke down and started crying every time I heard it. And as you may have guessed, this only fired my stepfather up more and made him even angrier. I lived in this hell until my mother gave birth to my stepfather's baby. It was a boy. My mother wasn't blind, and she saw how her husband treated me. And now that Hugo had his own child, she realized that things would only get worse, and then my mother made her choice. She called my father and explained the whole situation. He understood everything and said that he would come over to get me. By that time, my father had abandoned his pointless music career and worked as an office manager. He looked totally different from how I imagined him for all these years, so I was scared when I was climbing into his car and leaving my former family. But you know what? This was the moment when my real and normal life began. Of course, after I moved, I remained wary and tense for a pretty long time. Yes, he was my father, but I didn't know anything about him. I had no idea what to expect from him. But you know what? Much later, he admitted to me that he felt the same way. My father didn't have another family. He had no other children besides me, and he had no experience with how to behave with children either. As a result, he chose the best possible tactic. He began to treat me as if we were friends. Of course we both knew who was the boss there, but he never emphasized this and never tried to humiliate me. And the first thing he did when we arrived at his house was to give me some of his old guitars, and he taught me a couple simple chords right away. "If you get along with this thing, we'll play together in the garage on the weekends," he said. Well, I did, and he kept his promise. A few years have passed now, and I started remembering Hugo as if it were some nightmare that I had in my childhood. Now that I've grown up even more, I remember, with anger, the ways he used to make me cry. What sick pleasure can an adult man derive from showing his superiority over a 10-year-old boy and making him suffer? I hope he treats his own son differently. Yes, I know very little about how my mother's family lives now. As I grew up, I couldn't forgive her for her betrayal, so I really don't stay in touch with her at all. Sometimes I write to Lindsay. I hope that she's gotten luckier than I was, but I still don't think that she's happy in that family, and I hope that I'll be able to get her out of there once I get old enough. This is my story. Please tell me if you've ever been the subject of psychological pressure in your family, and don't forget to share my story. Maybe my experience will help someone.